The following program is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation.
Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Heather Berlin.
And I'm Faith Saley. We're going to be reviewing current movies, TV shows, and sometimes checking out a blast from the past, but from the scientific point of view. Today we're going to take a look back at some of our best moments of our first season.
We started out looking at Oscar-nominated films Birdman, Interstellar, and The Theory of Everything.
Our guest, astrophysicist Emily Rice, had this to say about Interstellar.
What do we need to know about time and gravity to really understand Interstellar?
Well, when you get close to a black hole, you wouldn't actually be compressed, you'd be stretched. Because of the tidal forces, the gravity is very, very strong around a black hole, and so you would actually have, closer to the black hole, you would have significantly stronger gravitational forces than slightly further away, and so you'd be stretched out. I think Neil Tyson coined the term spaghettification for what happens when you get close to a black hole. But really for this movie, it's actually important to understand general relativity to understand the plot of this movie, which is, I think, perhaps the first time that that's been necessary, maybe in Contact, because they also invoke wormholes in order to explain the interstellar travel in Contact. But the great thing is that the movie actually does a fantastic job because one of the astronauts explains general relativity actually fairly well. So general relativity explains gravity using the curvature of space-time. So the idea is that instead of mass being attracted to one another, and that's the force of gravity in the classical sense like Newton came up with, instead of gravity being that attractive force, general relativity says that gravity is actually the curvature of space-time that's caused by mass. And then so other mass in the universe and even light in the universe reacts to the curvature of space when it travels through the universe. So we do think that general relativity is actually a valid way of describing the universe.
The Imitation Game and Into the Woods are two great and very different movies. We had cryptologist Rosario Gennaro join us to expound on the work of Alan Turing, and then had him hang around and apply theories of pattern recognition to the work of Stephen Sondheim in our discussion of Into the Woods. I don't know about you guys, but Sondheim sticks in my head like glue on a sticky bun wrapped in Velcro. I mean, but that's because, you know, I've been going to see Broadway shows since I was a teenager. I wanted to be Bernadette Peters in the original cast of Into the Woods. I saw it in Broadway in 1987. Wow. But how does it feel to you guys when you hear it?
When I saw Into the Woods, then I always come out with the last two songs, you know, like No One Is Alone and Children Will Listen.
Which makes me sob.
Right. But for me, it's, you know, those patterns, they're almost like intellectually satisfying. You know, those, like going back to the Imitation Game, what allowed Turing to break the enigma was that there were those patterns, and pattern is information, right? So when I see those patterns in the music, my brain sort of immediately said there is information here that I need to latch onto. And so the patterns for me are really like, you know, the intricacies, or they may not be particularly appealing from a purely musical, you know, I don't go out like, you know, singing.
Well, there's a difference. Okay, there's a difference between what's aesthetically pleasing and what sticks into your mind or in your brain. So sometimes we call them earworms, right? Those songs you just can't get out of your head, and they're not necessarily the songs you like the most.
Hey, baby, baby.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, my husband once played a Britney Spears song, and then I couldn't get it out of my head.
Turns into an ear python.
Yeah, exactly. And so we call that involuntary memory. You know, certain things get stuck in your memory. And again, evolutionarily speaking, if you think about it, information was spread via song, and the best way to remember it was rhythm and rhyme. And so some even think that we sung before we spoke. And when we look at language in other species, we look at bird songs because the way birds sing is similar to our language. So, you know, these patterns and the music, they're meant to be sticky. They're meant to help with our memory because they were meant to spread information. But sometimes it doesn't mean we necessarily always like the songs that get stuck in our head. So that, aesthetics is a whole nother field, which, again, we don't really know exactly how that works. Neil deGrasse Tyson joined us for a conversation about why Hollywood loves to fear scientists. We talked about the Lazarus effect, particle fever, and one of Neil's favorites, Them.
There are so many scary movies with this same storyline. I'm just beginning to wonder, is Hollywood in love with a mad scientist?
Right? So, well, first of all, you said a classic tale. I don't know that stories portrayed scientists as evil and diabolical before the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yeah.
That may have been the first foray into a world of scientists gone wild? No, scientists turned
rogue,
diabolical.
Yeah,
right. So classic in the sense in the past century and a half, perhaps. But before then, I don't know that there's that tradition of thinking of scientists in that way.
But it's not even that the scientists are necessarily portrayed as diabolical. They're usually just doing something because they're genuinely interested in, experimenting, and then it goes,
There's a fork in the road,
Yeah.
and it could have gone good, but then it went bad.
Right.
Right. And so, but in addition, this notion of playing God, it depends on what it is, what power of God is it that you are asserting that the scientists took, all right? Is it creating life? Okay, fine. But scientists, we have split atoms. We have invented elements on the periodic table that are not otherwise created in nature. We have invented seedless watermelons. These are
Now you're talking.
we turned, what do you call it?
Wolves.
Wolves into lap poodles. And so the capacity to intersect with the operations of nature for our own curiosity and for our own benefit is not simply, are you bringing someone back from the dead? We've been doing this from the beginning, ever since there was civilization.
But all of those wonderful things you just mentioned, those aren't the stuff of movies that get people, buying tickets to a movie theater, right?
Correct.
So there's something.
They cherry pick the science that they think is diabolical, that they think is usurping the power of God, and then they make a movie of it.
Well,
Correct.
there's something compelling to lay people, to non-scientists, about thinking of the scientist is so scary and diabolical. I mean, when I think of a trope of a villain in a movie, you think it's scientists and the mafia. Like you guys are right up there, right? Who can you rely on for being a scary bad guy in a movie?
Yeah.
But no, I think that Hollywood loves scientists because of the fact that they can have such a big impact. And so they often take it in the negative direction, but we can also have an impact in the positive direction. But sometimes we just don't know what the impact is going to be, like, the atom bomb, right? I think, people early on working on the kind of science that led to the atom bomb weren't thinking this is something that could destroy the world. So I think Hollywood really latches on to the fear that people have of the unknown consequences of what science is doing.
Yeah, precisely. Not only the unknown consequences, but if the science itself is a little unfamiliar, then there's more sort of creative latitude to imagine it at its worst. If you fully understood the science, you wouldn't be worried about it. I think
There aren't horror movies about photosynthesis.
Right, exactly.
Heather and I reviewed the film Force Majeure, and then Ira Flato joined us in a conversation about visceral human fear. Heather, you talk about things from a sort of evolutionary point of view and what females have looked for in males forever. These P's, protect, provide, and procreate. So when Ebba, the mother and wife in this movie, finds out that her husband does not, in fact, protect, she works really hard to still keep the family together because she lives in this modern world where he doesn't have to fend off lions. So would you say that in a modern world that these 3 Ps apply less?
Well, I mean, I think in a practical sense, yes. Now that women can work and also be providers, we maybe are having the view of what we value in men is changing. And we're, like, for example, we're expecting men to be more involved in childcare and, housework and that kind of thing. And so maybe she values that from him and isn't looking at him so much as being a protector, but more of a part of this family unit, which you can understand. But I also think that after many, 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 many years of evolution, I mean, this modern time that we're in right now is so short that, we're kind of these like Stone Age brains, right, in a modern kind of world or in a modern skull. And so all of those deep sort of desires to have this protector aren't going to go away so fast. And so you can tell, even though she might have made a conscious decision to stay with him, that the way she looks at him as a man and values him is probably certainly diminished. We've discussed fear and we've discussed ignorance, but what happens if we apply those ideas to the general population? So, I mean, you work in the public, with the public all the time, and what are we seeing and learning out there?
It's a really good topic, because what I've learned in my years as a journalist and as a science journalist, and this is a very fearful thing to me as a journalist, is that if you really can't change people's minds. I mean, if you present them with all kinds of evidence, whether it's about vaccination and autism, or it's about global warming and the melting of the glaciers, if they, for whatever reasons, political, religious, or whatever, don't want to believe in this, they're going to find something in the data that you present them to take out that strengthens their opinion, no matter how overwhelming the data is. And it's scary.
It's true. It's actually, that's why it's very hard to change people's fears, like who have phobias, because you can give them all the information about, let's say, the statistics of plane crashes, but they'll find the one incident, you know, like, but what about that crash? And so it's very hard to change people's belief system, their core beliefs or their schemas, we would call it. They have to be willing to change, because if you're not willing to change, no matter how much evidence in the world, it's true, they'll still find that one thing that's going to support the way they think.
You have to have a really overwhelming evidence, what we would call a paradigm shift. Something has to, and I would think that is something like that is the melting of the glaciers, or, you know, the North Pole now free of ice in the summertime. It's something that confronts your vision. You know, we said your eyes are the most important things. You see this, and you now have a clash going on about your logical side and your emotional side. About I can't really deny this. And if you show it often enough, people will get the image.
This was an interesting show. We looked at PTSD through the lens of Clint Eastwood's films American Sniper and Gran Torino. We're joined today by Gerard Ilaria, Director of Operations at the Headstrong Project at Weill Cornell Medical College, and Derek Coy, a U.S. Marine and veteran of the Afghan War.
Did either of you see anything of your own experiences reflected in this film, American Sniper?
I think just for me personally, I think one of the things it touches on, and it's really, I won't say highly controversial, but a lot of people had a lot of opinions on this movie. But I think one of the things it nails is the idea of reintegrating. You spend so much time in the military learning how to do your job, learning how to execute these specific skill sets, and then when you get out, you're kind of brand new. So the idea of what do I do now? How am I supposed to feel? Is this normal? All these questions are running through your mind, and it's kind of all hits you at once. So I feel like that idea of not knowing what that next step is, a lot of veterans can kind of agree that that's kind of a weird place to be in. One of the things that I really enjoyed about American Sniper was the focus on moral injury. A lot of people don't really understand the nuances of mental health. I mean, most people don't. But the idea of different veterans having different experiences, what really sticks with you. You look at someone like Chris Kyle that, you know, he's killed almost 200 people in combat, and you think like, wow, that must come with some kind of mental baggage. But if you listen to any of his interviews or hear him speak, that's almost the easy part. What was hard is the people he couldn't save, the people that were on his team that didn't come home with them. And those are the things that stick with you. So for each veteran, it's a different instance. It's maybe you saw something that you couldn't do anything about, or something happened to someone that you're close with that you weren't there, and you always think, what if, could I have done something different? And I think those are the things that really transpire. But again, it's all different. It's all unique to each veteran with their experience, their upbringing, combat experience, you name it.
I've heard PTSD described as physical trauma. So from a neurological perspective, what does that mean?
Well, I mean, there's two issues there. One is there's been a lot of studies which have looked at the brain of people who have PTSD, and there are some actual structural differences and neurochemical differences in their brain. Some have smaller hippocampus, hippocampi, which are involved in memory. There's differences in cortisol levels and their HPA axis, this sort of, which makes them hypervigilant. It's sort of, so a small, we call it, they have an exaggerated startle response. So a small little noise will trigger this system in the brain and cause a lot of anxiety and arousal.
Sounds exhausting.
Yeah, and so,
live that
I
way.
mean, there is really a physical aspect of it, but the other thing is that, and this is something that we've tried to disentangle, is what's the difference between having, because a lot of them have had head trauma, actual physical, either a bang to the head or some kind of shrapnel. And so how do you separate the symptoms from traumatic brain injury from those of PTSD? They both seem to have a physical basis, and then they cause these psychological problems. But to disentangle these two is often very difficult. So I think everything that is psychological is ultimately related to something in the brain. So it makes sense that if you want to call it a physical, disorder, it is as well as a psychological disorder.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our approach, and whether it's because we have gotten the feedback from veterans that working at this as a physical injury is the way to go, because that also reduces stigma a lot, as compared to this is a psychological thing, which in many people's minds get tied to weakness or strength or more whatever. So we certainly come at it from the physical, but I think we do a lot of work on stabilizing and quieting people's nervous system, just teaching folks stuff about diaphragmatic breathing or how to engage the parasympathetic nervous system to keep things to get one's idle lower in day-to-day life, so that your kind of resilience with every day-to-day kind of stuff doesn't throw you into rage or take your prefrontal cortex offline so that you can't do functions because you're just way up in basically fight or flight.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other physical aspects of it is that there's this over-responsivity of the amygdala, this sort of one of the emotional centers of the brain, and then there's lack of enough prefrontal activation to kind of down-regulate it. But some of the therapies and even some new drugs like even psychedelics they're using now or MDMA can bring the prefrontal cortex online and kind of down-regulate the hyper-emotionality and the amygdala and allow the memories to kind of resurface in a non-emotional way, or not so much, triggering all those emotions, and they can be reintegrated into the brain. But it is a physical process.
Yes, and I think the other physical pieces that we're just constantly working with guys and women on, all the stuff you would do even with somebody who has any anxiety disorder. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Let's get them to be able to sleep if they can't, but are you sleeping? Are you getting REM sleep? Are you exercising? Which, has so many benefits for folks. And if they're doing it regularly, then, that's just a huge help in stabilizing. And then we can kind of wade into the more difficult material, which is to go back in and start dealing with the specific traumatic memories that have folks that are waking them up or making their lives not great.
Derek, did you see anything in American Sniper that you felt didn't nail the experience of someone with PTSD?
Yeah, but I would have to go back to my earlier point that it's so different. It's hard. A lot of people will watch American Sniper and they'll be so critical of it, which I completely understand. But it's like you can't fit all the nuances of mental health problems and war and trauma into 2 hours into a movie.
So your personal criticism would be what?
It's tough. Again, it's tough to say because based off the book, I actually feel it did an amazing job of telling the story that Chris Kyle told in his book. So in that sense, I thought it was pretty spot on. My criticism would be treating of Iraqi nationals, the way the war was viewed, things of that nature. But as far as what the movie was able to do, I think it was a really good depiction of what his story was in the book that he wrote.
When 50 Shades of Grey came out, we talked about the science of sex.
But we mixed it up a little by looking back at two major erotic titles preceding 50 Shades of Grey, Fatal Attraction and Last Tango in Paris. In its review of Last Tango, The Village Voice reported vomiting by well-dressed wives. And for his work on Last Tango in Paris, Bernardo Bertolucci was convicted of obscenity by an Italian court and had his voting and other civil rights revoked for 5 years. 43 years later, 50 Shades of Grey is at least as graphic.
Absolutely.
Right? And no one's going to jail and no one's throwing up over it. So Helen, what's going on in our society that we're open to this?
I think the biggest modern social trend is women piling into the job market in cultures around the world and reassuming the kinds of jobs that they had a million years ago as hunter-gatherer women. And as women gain economic power, they're gaining social power and sexual power and expressing their sexuality. And we're seeing this, tsunami change in male-female relations.
I fully agree. So I think that the women's lib, in a way, has allowed for the more kind of, people are more accepting. It's like an empowerment of women. And I know it sounds strange, but like, strippers, even prostitutes who are, in a sense, feel sometimes empowered by the kind of sexual control that they're taking over these situations. And so I think the more liberated the society, women are in the society, the more people are more accepting of these kinds of films. And that's why they're still censored in certain places in the Middle East. The version that I saw was from, I think, China, where they're cutting out these scenes because it's still not acceptable.
Another 50 years, they'll be right where we are. I mean, we seem to be running leading the way in terms of, feminine expression of sexuality.
I just want to add this in, which is that The Last Tango in Paris, first of all, I hated it. I mean, I loathed that movie. I want those 129 minutes of my life back. It was indulgent and unsatisfying. It didn't, I thought Marlon Brando was off. I hated it, okay? But also the sex scenes, as opposed to 50 Shades of Grey, whatever your criticism of it, they were devoid of romance, but they were also devoid of connection. There was no chemistry between Brando's character and the girl.
Yeah.
He was in his early 50s and she was 19 years old. I actually read about the casting, and they did not feel any chemistry towards each other.
Interesting.
And he told her, "You look just like my daughter," and she was the same age as one of his daughters. But to me, it was just bloated, not sexy, and the way that he was aggressive with her did not, even though she was there and kept showing up, it didn't have that patina of romance and the consensual aspect that 50 Shades of Grey did. So even now, I'm here 43 years later, I find it more likely to make me vomit too. I really, really didn't like this film.
In real life, I also read an interview with her, and she said that in retrospect, it felt like she was being raped throughout the film.
Well, the scene with the butter, the anal sex scene,
psychologically,
was not in the script.
Psychologically, yeah. Oh, really? And
it was not in the script. She was told minutes before.
But she kept on going back to it. She kept on going to that apartment. She gave him the butter. She didn't know what he was going to do with the butter, but she went through it. I mean, it was, in that way, all three movies have this same sort of drive for sex and for romance and for connection, even though it's all pathological. I mean, I don't know how pathological it is in 50 Shades of Grey, but certainly it was pathological in Last Tango in Paris. But what was so interesting is the power shifted. He had all the power, and he was raping her over and over, but she was there for it. But in the end, it's he that fell madly in love with her, and she that rejected him when he didn't have the resources that Christian Grey has.
Another major theme in modern filmmaking is artificial intelligence.
We compared Ex Machina to Blade Runner with neuroscientist Christoph Koch.
What we think of as consciousness, like the subjective experiences we have, if you break it down to like, oh, that algae has a little bit of it or whatever, it kind of takes away from the fundamental.
Well, but that's also the thing about life. We used to think we are unique, and then we realize, no, there are other creatures out there that are like us, and they also evolved. And we are part of that grand continuum, from algae to monkeys to us. So it may well also be true that with respect to conscious experience, there are many conscious experience is much more widespread than we think, and this is a very ancient insight. As Heather mentioned, this is known as pan-psychism. Pan, everywhere, psyche, the soul. That maybe the universe is in soul. Maybe consciousness is in many more things than we like to believe, including possibly in some of our simulacra, some of our artifacts, maybe in the internet, maybe in robots, maybe in things like Ava.
At one point in the film, the hero, Caleb, questions his own humanity. He wonders, am I a human or am I a robot? Should we all be questioning that?
No.
How do we, why not? How do I know?
I know.
How?
Because I have so philosophers have this term, I have direct experience of my own conscious experience. And so that's a tragedy also of life. I never know your consciousness. I don't know Heather's feelings, I don't know your feeling. All I can read your feeling, what you say, the way you behave, right? But I have direct access to my own feelings. I know that I know. I know that I'm a man. I know I'm Christoph. I know I'm going to die. I know I see you.
So the problem, I mean, one of the problems with studying consciousness, like in a scientific way, is that it really, you can only get it. It's this first-person subjective experience, and it's very hard to measure. Let's say measure it in a lab, because as Christoph said, you know, he knows he has it, but he doesn't know you have it or I have it. But there's another philosopher named Dan Dennett, and he said, you know, sure, we have a soul. It's just made up of these really trillions of little tiny robots, right? Which basically is each cell in our brain is like a little tiny, you know, robot, right? Each one in itself is not particularly conscious, but when they all sort of come together into this sort of machine, which is our brain and our body, it produces this subjective feeling. But in a sense, we are robots. We are these creatures that come pre-programmed. You know, we have instincts and drives, and even though they might have evolved over time.
This is another discussion. It sounds like you, from a scientific point of view, you're saying there's no free will.
Oh yeah, no.
Okay.
Well,
that's
yeah, but that's another.
Go there.
We hope you've enjoyed a look back at the best of the first season of Science Goes to the Movies.
Don't forget to check us out on the web at cuny.tv under the Science tab, where you'll find past shows, additional content, and a link to our app.